Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and it's great to be here with you at Glastonbury. As Hugh told you, unfortunately Chris can't be here. It's due to a problem with Spain and grandchildren, so we won't go into it any further than that. But I do notice, looking at my first slide, that it's probably just as well that he's not here, because as you will see, I've managed to split my name into two. Now, Chris is definitely the artistic one in our partnership, and last time I made a slideshow for a talk, he said, Alan, that's not megalithic. He said, that's Neanderthal. So you'll just have to make do with the slides as I've put them together, but I'm sure they'll all make sense. Now then, I'm going to see if by the magic of... oh, look at that. Incredible. Okay, so this is the book. Why is it... Never mind, this will do for starters. I'm talking to you tonight about our book, Before the Pyramids. But it's important, I think, that before I do, because some of you will have not read our books and don't know what our information is about, that I go back a little bit and give you a brief resume of where we're coming from in the first place. And this, therefore, is the first slide and the most important slide with regard to our common research. Just over 20 years ago, I decided to take a holiday in Crete, in Greece. I had an ulterior motive for wanting to be there because I'd been interested for a long time in the Minoan civilization. Now, the Minoans flourished in Crete until probably around about 1400, 1450 BC. They are renowned as being Europe's first super civilization. They had a wonderful civilization. They were great sailors, great traders, a very peaceful civilization. So it seems they had no major standing army. They had a very good navy. They could defend against piracy and so forth. But generally speaking, it was a very equitable and very feminine-led sort of society. Now, one of the things that interested me most about the Minoans was their ability to count. I knew before I went to Crete that they had their own measuring systems, their own weight systems, and their own accountancy systems, because, of course, they were great traders. And one of the devices I was most interested in was what you can see on the screen before you now. It's called the Phaistos disc. It was found in the ruins of a palace, the Palace of Phaistos on the south of Crete, at the beginning of the 20th century. It dates back to an estimated 2000 BC. It's a double-sided disc, about 5.5 inches across, and on both sides of the disc is a spiral which is incised into the disc. Within the spiral, in both cases, there are hieroglyphics which are set within groups. Before I even went to Crete, I had an idea exactly what this disc might do. I was able to go and see the real one in Heraclean Museum and research during my period there, and subsequently bore out what I already believed. Now, we don't know what the disc says because the hieroglyphics obviously represent the Minoan language. We don't know what language they spoke, so these hieroglyphs have never been deciphered. It wasn't so much an interest to me to know what the disc said as what it could do, because if we take each hieroglyph within each group representing one digit, it turns out that the Phaistos disc is a wonderful multifunctioning machine which can do all sorts of wonderful tricks as far as the sky is concerned. It can, for example, predict the position in the zodiac of the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus at any time on any day ever in a very, very simple way. But my first idea about the disc is that it must have been associated with a calendar. I took this to be the case because on one side of the disc there are 30 groups. On the other side of the disc there are 31 groups. And I hypothesized that maybe this represented 2 months of a calendar which alternated between 30 and 31 days for each month. And straight away that led me to believe just maybe the Minoans celebrated a year of 366 days. That might seem a little bit odd to us, but it's not really. We live on an earth which unfortunately, in terms of its or orbit around the sun does not have an even number of days. The solar year is 365.2564 days, which is damned inconvenient if you happen to be a farmer. So we have to do one of two things. We either have to have a year of 365 days and compensate by adding days every so often, or 366 days and removing days every so often. And I came to understand, and it's a long and complicated explanation, which is not actually part of this talk, that what they had done was they had devised a secondary calendar which had units of 123 days, which are indicated on side A of the disc. And after 4 times 123 days, which is 492 days, they removed 1 day from the ritual 366-day calendar, and that meant that their calendar would remain accurate with the solar calendar for 10,000 years without any other correction having to be made. This is absolutely stupendous and is far, far better than the system we're using now when we're working in the opposite direction. So, they were able to resolve their dilemma of the 366-day year, and I was able to say with some certainty that I hit upon something very significant, because no other culture until that point in time had ever used this sort of calendar as far as we knew. If we move on to the next slide, which is that one, hooray, it works. I took the information that I already had about the face-dust disc, and I looked at the Minoan way of measuring distance. A Canadian archaeologist by the name of J. Walter Graham had discovered that the Minoans used a linear unit which was 30.365 centimetres in length, very close to the modern statute foot, but just very slightly different. He'd come to this conclusion because of the measurements he'd taken on all the known Minoan palaces and other buildings. There was a little bit of criticism at first. People said it may be true, or you may just be making something up that just happens to fit. But then a few years after, another palace was found at Zakro, which hadn't been discovered before, and lo and behold, his measurements fitted. So now everybody is pretty sure that the Minoan foot was 30.365 centimetres in length. I wanted to know if this meshed with any other measuring system, ancient measuring system, which we knew about in Europe, but they are very few and far between. The only one which I already knew about was the Megalithic Yard, which was rediscovered by Professor Alexander Thom, who I'll mention more specifically in a moment. And he said that the Megalithic Yard, which he claimed had been used in most of the megalithic structures throughout Britain and in Brittany, was 82.966 centimetres in length, or 2.722 feet. And very quickly I came to discover that 1,000 Minoan feet is exactly the same as 366 megalithic yards. And it's so exactly the same that it's a mark of respect to J. Walter Graham, Alexander Thom, and to the people who designed these units in the first place. And what it told me was there was likely to be a very definite connection between those two units. So it's two different ways of measuring the same linear length. Now, I mentioned a minute ago Alexander Thom. That's him. Alexander Thom was born towards the end of the 19th century. He grew to become a professor of engineering at Oxford University. On the way, he was fascinated by astronomy and also by archaeology. He was a Scot, and because of that, he was particularly interested in the megalithic monuments in Scotland, especially the early circles. And he had a hunch that the stone circles in Scotland had been built to track the tortuous position of the moon across its long periods. And he wanted to prove this to himself. And so he set himself a task which became a lifetime task to survey carefully and to measure extremely carefully every megalithic structure that he could find. And he was doing this for 55 years in almost every spare moment that he had. All the famous structures were measured, and he even carried on down and did the rows in Carnac and in other places in Brittany. And he came to lots of conclusions, most of which the archaeological community has accepted, to the extent that he's sometimes called the father of astroarchaeology. But there is one thing Alexander Thom found that archaeologists didn't like and still don't like that, and that was the megalithic yard. Thom said that it was a consequence of all of the measurements he'd collected, that the people who built the megalithic structures of Britain and France had used one standard unit of measurement, in fact 2 or 3, but all based on the same unit of measurement. He said, I'll call it the megalithic yard, it exists. They said, can you prove it exists? And he said, it's there. And the British Society for Statistics gave him a gold medal for finding it. But archaeologists said, this is absolutely impossible. And you can see their point of view. How could people living between 3,500 BC and at least 2,000 BC have created and sustained a linear unit which remained totally unchanged across that whole period of time and across that great geographical distribution? Thom couldn't answer the question, but he said, even though I can't answer the question, they did it somehow because it's there in the statistics. This was at the point when Chris Knight and I got together, and we decided that Thom deserved somebody looking into the situation and trying to find out exactly what the megalithic yard was, how it had been maintained. We didn't know at that time that we would end up writing a book about it. We certainly didn't know we'd end up writing 4 books about it, but that's what happened. We searched really hard to find something within the world, the length of an arm, the length of a leg, the length of a centipede, anything which would just always come out at being the same linear unit, and there is nothing. But by a stroke of the greatest luck, when we were having a conversation one day, somebody, and we still don't know who did it, we both claim that we are the geniuses that thought this up, somebody said, what about a pendulum? And then everything clicked. There is only one thing in the world that never changes, or if it does change, it changes across a tremendously long period of time, and that is the rate at which the Earth turns. Would it be possible somehow to monitor that and to use it to devise a unit of measurement? We knew that in a sense this was done much later, because we knew that when the metric system was devised, originally they had wanted to use the length of a pendulum that beat in 1 second, the seconds pendulum, to define the meter. In the end, they made it a geographical unit. But we knew that people had thought about that before. We said to ourselves, could the megalithic people have thought about it? So, there we are. There's our pendulum. About as simple as you can get. A piece of string, a weight, and the fulcrum at the top. Chris has made this one a super-duper pendulum, but you can hold it with your fingers just as easily. Now, the thing about a pendulum is, the only thing that affects its swing and the time of its swing is the length of the string and the force of gravity, which changes by a tiny, tiny amount across the surface of the planet. But to all intents and purposes, once you set your pendulum swinging, it will always keep the same time, just as long as you keep it agitated. If you swing it too hard, it'll start jerking, but generally speaking, it's a very reliable way of measuring time, which of course is why it was used so much in the manufacture of clocks. So we have our pendulum, and how can you make that into a linear unit of measurement? Well, what we devised was this. It's a braced wooden frame. It is just 4 pieces of wood joined together by ropes of a specific length. What you have to do is you have to stand in the middle of a large open space with an eastward view. You have to make yourself a circle. It doesn't really matter how big the circle is. And then you have to divide that circle into 366 units. Now, the reason that we chose that was because we figured by this time that there had been a different kind of geometry. That what the Minoans were telling us was not only was our year 366 days, but our geometry had 1 degree for each day of the year, therefore we had a 366 degree geometry. We didn't know if that was the case. We were trying out, we were experimenting, which of course is what science is all about. So we divide our circle into 366 segments. We take one of those segments over in the east, and we make sure that from where we stand at the centre of the circle, that this braced wooden frame is exactly the same length as one of those segments. What we do then is we put our braced wooden frame up on 2 legs, and we make it in such a way that celestial bodies which are falling towards the ground on their way back to the dark side of the earth will pass through that channel in the braced wooden frame. By trial and error, we eventually came to realise that what had been used to make this calculation was not a star, but in fact the planet Venus. And the planet Venus, when it was becoming an evening star, it had just crossed the sun, and it was starting to appear as an evening star, moving rapidly in the opposite direction, counter to the zodiac, gave exactly the right timing. Now, if one stood at the centre of the circle and watched Venus passing through that box and swung a pendulum while it was happening, if that pendulum swung exactly 366 times as Venus passed down that slot, that pendulum would have to be 1/2 of a megalithic yard in length. We cheered because we knew. Alexander Thom had said, yes, they used the megalithic yard, but they also used the half megalithic yard. They used another unit, which he called the megalithic rod, which was 2.5 megalithic yards. So we knew that for their standard unit, they'd taken this pendulum length, they doubled it, and that was a megalithic yard. So how could it be passed on from generation to generation? It didn't need to be. They simply recreated it wherever they needed it. And the difference in the accuracy of this unit, Alexander Thom found, the discrepancy, is exactly the discrepancy one would expect to find in gravity between the north of Scotland and the south of Brittany. So we thought that that was proven. Scientists didn't and still don't, but that's their business, not mine. So that allowed us gradually to build megalithic geometry. So what we came up with in the end, and again, I'm having to skip through it a bit because I want to tell you something about the recent book. Megalithic geometry is based on the number of days in the ritual year, therefore 366. And now we knew that not only the Minoans, but also the megalithic peoples of Great Britain must have been aware of and used a 366 degree circle. So circles have 366 degrees. We discovered that each degree they had split into 60 megalithic minutes of arc, very similar to modern geometry. But when we came to the minute, we soon began to realise, remember the 366 megalithic yards and the 1,000 Minoan feet? We knew that was a geometric unit. So we said each minute represents 6 megalithic seconds of arc, and therefore each second is also equal to 366 megalithic yards of the polar circumference of the Earth. This is absolutely accurate. So we know that these people must have known the polar circumference of the Earth. Their estimation of it using this geometry is as equally as accurate as any assessment we have now. And you'll hear a lot of different interpretations of what that is, because it depends whether you're measuring over land, whether you're measuring over sea. But generally speaking, it's 40,012 kilometres, and that comes out at 366 megalithic yards for each megalithic second of arc of the polar circumference. I hope that's clear. So, megalithic measuring system, based on the size of the Earth, based on the mass of the Earth. It isn't just the megalithic yard. If you make a cube, which is 1/10 sides of a megalithic yard, and you fill that cube with water, it will weigh a pound. Sorry, it will be 1 pint of water. If you pour the water out of the cube and fill the cube with any kind of cereal grain, like wheat or barley or oats, it will weigh 1 pound. So both the pound and the pint ultimately are derived from the megalithic yard. In 2000 BC, or between then and 1700 BC, the megalithic yard vanished, but its accompanying units didn't. the pound and the pint survive. Neither of those units have anything to do with the foot. They are derivatives of the megalithic yard. And we've even discovered since that it would have been quite possible to measure temperature using the megalithic scale. The reason we say this is if you was to take a temperature scale in which 0 represented freezing point of water and boiling point represented 366 degrees, then absolute 0 would be exactly minus 10,000 degrees. Absolutely. It's unbelievable. It's stunning. So by this time, we were in a position to think about writing our own book. And we put that book together, but we wanted to make some predictions. There were things we had expected to find that we hadn't found. So these are some of them. And we wrote this down in our book. We expect to find circles with a diameter or a circumference of 366 megalithic yards. That should be self-evident. It was a unit that we knew they knew about. They must have used it somewhere. Or megalithic rods, which are just, each one is 2.5 megalithic yards. We said we expect to find circles with a diameter or circumference of 732 megalithic yards or rods. That's twice 366. And the reason that we expected that was because of the next expectation. We expect to find circles with a diameter or a radius of 233 megalithic yards or rods. We believe that this would be the case because we knew these people were very bright, and we thought they must have tripped over a fact that we tripped over. Any circle which has a diameter of 233 units of any kind will also have a circumference of 732 units of the same kind. I hope that makes sense to you. We call it a pi survivor. There are very few circles in which the diameter and the circumference are both even numbers of the same units. That's one of them, and it's twice 366, so we thought if we fell upon it, they must surely have fallen upon it. Those are the predictions we made. Okay, now, we went on and we wrote Civilization 1. We've got the book downstairs. I hope some of you will have read it, and if you haven't, get it out of the library, borrow it off a friend, steal it, do whatever you like, but read the book. Because we so enjoyed writing it. Now, a little while after we'd got the book on the road, in fact, we'd written a book on another subject since, I was watching a television programme by Dan Cruikshank. Cruikshank is an architect and an archaeologist, loves old buildings. This particular programme he was doing was about the city of Bath, which is not so very far from here. A lot of the city of Bath was built by a character called John Wood, who thrived at the end of the 18th century. He built many buildings there. This is part of one of them. It's known as King's Circus. It's a huge circle of Regency houses, very beautiful, very worth seeing. And what's more, in the centre there is a group of trees. And if you go into that group of trees and shout, it echoes round for about 5 seconds. We know because we've tried it. That was an accident, and it's got nothing to do with our investigation. So what is special about this was that Dan Cruikshank happened to mention what the diameter of the King's Circus was, and immediately it rang a bell in my mind. I knew the number that he was talking about. Because I'd been dealing so much with megalithic geometry. So Kate, my wife and I, happened to be doing some research in North Wales, and we struck out straight down to Bath. We had to go and see for ourselves. So early one morning, we got down there, we did our measurements with our tapes, much to the amusement of everybody who lives there, shouted a few times just to tell people we were there, and then came away with the measurements. And lo and behold, the circumference of the circle that is formed by the front of the houses in King's Circus is exactly 366 megalithic yards. How on earth could this come about? This is absolutely ridiculous. The megalithic yard and megalithic geometry disappeared by 1700 BC. Along comes this guy in the 18th century, builds himself a circle of houses, and lo and behold, it's 366 megalithic yards. But it's not quite that simple. When I came to do some research about this man, I discovered that he was an antiquarian. He loved things megalithic, which he thought were Roman, but let's forgive him for that. He loved them all the same. and he measured them all. And one of the ones that he measured was Stonehenge. And when I went to Stonehenge and had a look at Stonehenge, which we'd looked at in great detail before, Chris and I then noticed something that we hadn't noticed before. This is Stonehenge. It doesn't look very much like Stonehenge. It's Stonehenge 1. It's what Stonehenge looked like when people first started it. It was nothing more than a circular bank and ditch. Incidentally, it wasn't even a henge, really, because the ditch was outside the bank. And as I'll tell you in a moment, in a true henge, the ditch is always inside the bank. But we call it a henge, and we call it Stonehenge, and it's there, and it measures 366 megalithic yards in circumference. So our first impression was John Wood clearly had been really fixated by Stonehenge. He'd measured the henge, and he decided to build his circle of houses to reflect Stonehenge. And that is where that particular part of our investigation stopped. If I've got time at the end, I'll tell you how we come back to that. So we had a henge, and we knew that the reason we hadn't found those numbers we were looking for was because we hadn't been going old enough. Henges are much older than stone circles. By common consensus, many of the henges date back to at least 3,500 BC. Although in a few special cases they had, in most cases people had not started dragging stones around the landscape at that time, but of henges there were plenty. So could we find any more that conformed to our previous expectations? Well, we found the 3 biggest henges in the country, undoubtedly the 3 biggest henges in the world, but since there are no henges except in Great Britain, that might not be quite as good as it sounds. But there we go. This is what we found. This is an aerial view of Thornborough Henges in North Yorkshire, which by sheer coincidence happens to be equidistant from my house and Chrissy's house. So we met here a long time. That one there is the northern henge, that's the central henge, that's the southern henge. And they are joined together now, as they have always been joined, by a ritual avenue, which presumably, even when the henges were built, people used to walk up and down for one reason or another. Now, it's very difficult to guess from that picture just how big those henges are, and bear in mind there's 3 of them. Well, my only artistic enterprise that you will see tonight is this. In the middle is an aerial view of St. Paul's Cathedral, and it's in a henge, and it's in one of those henges. That is how big these henges are. They are utterly colossal. They dwarf any other megalithic structure in the country, and yet hardly anybody even knows about them. They're called the Thornborough Henge Array, and they're absolutely brilliant. And you have to trespass to even get in to see them. Next time in Yorkshire, trespass. Go and see them. They are really, really impressive. Okay, so this is what the Thornborough Henges look like. We have over here the northern henge, which at the moment is covered in woods and has been probably for many centuries, and so is extremely well preserved. It's very difficult to make much out of it when you're actually in it because of all the trees, but the banks and ditches still survive. We have banks there that are 4 or 5 metres in height, so you can see roughly what a megalithic structure looked like. Then there's the central henge, which is comparatively well preserved and much easier to see because it's open and all there is in the centre is sheep. And the southern henge is the least well preserved, partly ploughed out, but still fairly easy to see. Each of the henges is the same size. Now, if we look at the dimensions of the henges, we find, we come to that a little bit later on. I've got the dimensions a bit later on. One of the things that was interesting about the henges was that it's really peculiar shape. It looks as if it ought to be straight. It looks as if some megalithic beer was involved in the planning of it, because as you can see, it's not actually a straight line. It's got a dog leg in the middle. Now, one of the archaeologists, brave man he must have been, who dug this and discovered the dates were 3,500 BC, also dared to go into print and say, it looks very much like Orion's belt. He's probably now dead and buried, for all I know. But we decided, oh, this is Orion's belt, by the way. You see no expense spared. There are the 3 stars of Orion's belt, and you can see that they don't actually line up. There's a dog leg. So we said to ourselves, well, this is probably rubbish. So we'll superimpose the stars of Orion's belt onto Thornborough Henges and see what happens. And so we did. Voila, they fit. Oh no, so it's, first of all, that's the offset. So we'll carry on to the next one. And that's with the stars. The black dots are the stars superimposed onto the Henges. Incredible, an incredible fit. How on earth could such an incredible fit have come about? Well, first of all, I ought to tell you the dimensions of the Henges. Each of the Henges, originally, you can see that there's double banks and ditches, and that's because when they were first dug, when the Henges were first created, all of them originally were 732 megalithic yards in circumference. Then, 366 megalithic rods in circumference, each of them. Then soon after they'd first been created, those ditches and banks were levelled, they remade them, so the inner ones are the ones they are now, and each of those is 732 megalithic yards in circumference. The distance between the Henges, between that one and that one, is 366 megalithic rods. Between that one and that one is 360 megalithic rods. They are almost equidistant, but not quite. They are almost straight, but not quite. How on earth could they have got such an exact match? When you look, and if you go out tonight, you can still see Orion's belt. It's getting a bit near the summer, but you can still see it. When you do, look how small it is in the sky. These people had no telescopes. Your thumb at arm's length will cover the whole of Orion's belt. How on earth, with the naked eye, can you possibly tell the difference between the gap between one star and the next star? Well, they could do it, and they did do it, and we think this is how they did it. What they did was they built themselves an upright. They stood at a distance from it, looking east. The upright may have had a T-bar across it like this one, but to be quite honest, that's not necessary at all. They waited until Orion's belt went up in the sky until it turned. It goes up almost vertical. Eventually, it turns on its back. It doesn't do that so well now, but it did in 3500 BC. And when it was parallel with the horizon, that's when they wanted to view it. And as that star passed that post, they started to swing a pendulum. This was not a megalithic pendulum. This was a 1 second, 1 meter pendulum. And we're talking about 3500 BC. We know because we can recreate the experiment. They started to swing a pendulum when that star disappeared behind the upright. That pendulum swung 366 times before that star disappeared behind the upright. The same pendulum swung 360 times before that star disappeared behind the upright. They had the measurements they needed. They merely transmuted those beats of a pendulum to linear measurements on the ground, which in this case were megalithic rods in length, and they could lay out the Henges exactly as they've been in the sky and get them absolutely correct. There's so much I could tell you about Thornborough Henges. I could tell you that there's also a henge 10 miles away which represents the star Sirius, which of course is the star, the brightest star in the sky, and it's what the stars in Orion's belt point to. I can tell you that there are other henges which may represent other points in the constellation of Orion. And there's some henges missing, but so many are ploughed out. But all of these henges, and there's at least 6 or 7 of them in that particular part, near Ripon in North Yorkshire, are all the same size. And they are all absolutely massive. A huge effort in terms of manufacture. And what were they used for? Well, apparently, according to a lot of archaeological idea, they were meeting places. Each one is so big, you could have fitted the population of Great Britain into it without any trouble whatsoever. And there were 3 of them. And originally there were many more dotted about the landscape. There are lots of other ideas, meeting places. Well, yes, but if you were in the wrong part of the circle, you wouldn't be able to see the other people. Maybe they were meeting places, I don't doubt it. But what we think they were was They were a form of experimental astronomy. If you think about a stone circle does things that you want it to do. The sun will rise behind one stone, the moon will fall behind another stone. But that is astronomy set in stone, literally. If you want to carry on doing experiments, you don't want stones. You build yourself a bank, a circular bank of known proportions, and you can use as many sticks and great poles and trees along that bank top as you possibly want. And if your experiment isn't right, all you have to do is take out the sticks, put them somewhere else and keep trying. It's almost certain, I think, that that's what henges were originally used for. They could have had lots and lots of ceremonial purposes, but I think it's definitely the case that they were used for experimental astronomy at the very dawn of the megalithic understanding of the sky. Of course, we were quite well aware that not only the structures in Thornborough had been said to look like Orion's belt. The most famous ones of all are these, the pyramids in Egypt, the three major pyramids on the Giza Plateau. A friend of ours, Robert Boval, wrote a book some years ago in which he suggested that these two represented Orion's belt. We have written so much in our book about Egyptian religion, and it throws so much light on what religion may have been like in this country too, in our own islands at one time, in terms of why Sirius was important, why Orion was important. But time is short and I can't go into detail. It's an absolutely fascinating story. But was there any connection between Thornborough and Egypt? Well, what connection could there be? Thornborough was created in 3500 BC. We are told, and lots of people argue, but we are told that the pyramids were created around about 2500 BC. They were 1,000 years apart and hundreds of kilometres apart. Could there possibly be any other connection? Well, first of all, we had to check out what Robert Boval was saying. And sure enough, there we are. The stars of Orion's belt fit perfectly onto the three major pyramids on the Giza Plateau in Egypt. So, if we were going to work out whether there was any connection, we might first of all ask ourselves, well, we know how the henges were laid out in Thornborough. Did the Egyptians lay out the ground plan for their pyramids in the same way? We have some very sophisticated computer technology now which can show us the sky at any point back in time to about 10,000 BC. We can see what they saw. We can do hypothetical pendulum experiments that they could have done. We could not find any way that the Egyptians had used the same process. And we weren't surprised, because the pyramids are very much closer together than the henges are. And although they're a massive undertaking in terms of creation, they're very much smaller physical dimensions than the henges. But because we are mad people who do mad things, we happen to carry out the experiment for creating the ground plan for the pyramids, not in Egypt, but at Thornborough. And voila, 2500 BC, on the day of the winter solstice, it works. We are as sure as we can be, even though it's absolutely ridiculous, even though it's absolutely absurd, that the ground plan for the pyramids on the Giza Plateau in Egypt was not created in Egypt itself, but hundreds of kilometres away at Thornborough, and that somebody took that information to Egypt, and upon that information was based the ground plan of the pyramids, because it works perfectly. The problem with Egypt is it can't work there, because even at the time we're talking about 2500 BC, Orion's belt did not rise high enough at that latitude above the horizon to turn onto its back sufficiently so that the kind of experiment that had created Thornborough could be created again. So we take our chance. You know, we say what we find, we don't always meet with approval. In fact, we hardly ever meet with approval. But what we are saying is We think this is science. Anybody can take a calculator, anybody can look at a computer program and work out for themselves. Just because it seems odd doesn't mean to say that it's not right. And in each instance that I've been talking about so far tonight, if we are talking about coincidences, we are talking about colossal coincidences. And maybe in another 2 generations, the archaeologists will start to listen to us. Maybe they won't, but if we get enough people listening to us, the ground force, the groundswell of ordinary people will make the difference. Okay, so I'm now going to show you a picture of Washington, D.C. Why? What on earth can that have to do with any of this? This is the sting in the tail. If you think what you've heard so far is unbelievable, wait while you cop for this lot. We went back to look at Bath again. We thought, why did he make this circus the size of Stonehenge? Was it just that he'd copied Stonehenge? We wanted to be thorough. Could we find the megalithic yard anywhere else in Bath? Well, we thought we could, but we couldn't be absolutely certain about it. There was something very strange about John Wood, something that gelled with information that Chris and I had dealt with. It sounds very strange, but Chris and I do not just write books together on megalithic matters, we also write books together on Freemasonry and the history of Freemasonry. Chris is a Freemason, I'm not a Freemason. I stay out because I think I can't report what I find if I join the organisation. I have nothing against Freemasonry. I'm interested in it because of its mathematical and geometric potential. We knew that John Wood was a Freemason. Could that have had something to do with his use of the megalithic yard? We didn't know. Where could we go to find something that was built around about the same time as Bath, or as that part of Bath, and which might have had a lot of Freemasonic influence? Well, the place that we could think about immediately was Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. was built towards the end of the 18th century, after a slight fracas between Britain and America. And for some reason, they decided they wanted to be independent and they wanted their own capital city. So they took a piece of land, a diamond-shaped piece of land, 10 miles in each direction, and they said, we're going to make this our capital. And we looked at Washington, D.C. on Google Earth, and we found something which surprised us. This. And Chris found it, and Chris got on the phone to me, and he said, I found a henge in Washington, D.C. And I said, don't be ridiculous. And it was being ridiculous, because it's not a henge, it can't be henge. But what it is the Washington National Astronomical Observatory. In the middle of all that lot is the observatory. And this represents the perimeter. Why they built it that shape, we have no idea. We can't discover, but they did. But the strange thing about it is, from there to there, measures 732 megalithic yards exactly. Why should this be so? Had we come across another coincidence, and I must be careful that I don't overrun my time. So maybe it's a coincidence. Let's look further into it. Let's look at the centre of Washington, D.C. This is the centre of Washington, D.C. That is the Capitol building. That's the Washington Monument. But the Washington Monument was originally supposed to be slightly that way, and it wasn't because the ground there wasn't strong enough to take such a huge structure. And that, up here, is the White House. Now, Washington, D.C. was planned, supposedly, by a man called Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, who was, as his name sounds, was French, again a leading Freemason, but he was assisted by that man of all trades, George Washington, assisted by someone who was even brighter and even cleverer, Thomas Jefferson, and they decided they wanted to build Washington on a triangle. One of the points of the triangle was there, another one was there, another one was there, and then it came back down here. And you can see that Pennsylvania Avenue really more or less marks the hypotenuse of the triangle. It's, and also the mile represents the base of the triangle. So you can see nearly all the components of the triangle there. Everything else, we are told, was laid out from that. Why were we interested in Washington, apart from the reasons I've told you? All because of this man, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was the third president of the United States. He was one of the most famous of the founding fathers, I'll show you a picture of him. No, I won't, he's gone. Which doesn't surprise me, incidentally. You have to take my word for it, Thomas Jefferson really did exist. And apart from being a politician, he was a lawyer, he was an architect, he was a surveyor, he was just about everything. An incredible, incredible man. One of his first positions that he was given, after he'd been made ambassador in France to the new America, was to be made Secretary of State. And in 1790 he came to the capital, or what would be the capital, and he said to Congress, I want us to have a new system of measurements because we've cut our ties now with the mother country, we'll have our own system. He said, I want to base it on a yard or a seconds pendulum. But his seconds pendulum was slightly different because it wasn't a string, it was a rod. Now if you have a rod instead of a string and a weight, the rod will be half as long again to swing in the same time. So he wanted a 1 second rod. He divided that to make his units, and he made a cube and filled the cube with water to make his capacity and weight units. He did the whole system. But what had amazed us about this system, and we discovered this right back when we were doing Civilization 1, was that it encompassed all sorts of aspects of the megalithic system. Although you couldn't see it on the surface, the megalithic yard was in there statistically. And we thought this must have happened because he'd used more or less the same method to create it. We were stupid, but that's all we could think of. Now we come to wonder, is there anything in Washington, D.C. that would lead us to believe that Jefferson knew more about the megalithic system, which after all, as I've said, disappeared in 1700 BC. So we decided to look more closely, both at Jefferson and at Washington. And what we discovered right in the centre of Washington is this. This is called the ellipse. The ellipse is just south of the White House. It's on that line of the original triangle that joins Washington Monument with the White House. It's between the two. There is something unique about this. From there to there, measures 366 megalithic yards. And we went on to discover that it's the focal point of all sorts of measurements in Washington, D.C. First of all, let me show you where the ellipse is. The yellow lines represent the boundary of the District of Columbia, which is the D.C. in Washington, D.C. If you draw a line down from point to point and across from point to point, where those two lines converge, that is exactly where the ellipse is. The ellipse itself did not exist until after the American Civil War, but the land upon which it stood had been left vacant. It was fenced off with a big white fence, and it was known as the White Lot. So we took that to be our central node, as it indeed is the central node of the District of Columbia. And we joined that point to all the major intersections in the original city as it was laid out by L'Enfant. And lo and behold, we get a very strange pattern. Every one of these lines, doesn't matter what colour they are, every one of these lines is definable in terms of a number of units of 366 megalithic yards. Some of them are 5 times 366, some of them are 4 times 366, some of them are 10 times 366, but to an incredible degree of accuracy, each one of those is a megalithic measurement defined in seconds of megalithic arc of the polar circumference of the Earth. This is a plan laid down in Washington, underlying Washington itself and the eventual street plan, and you can only see it if you know about the megalithic system. Now, I want to just highlight this part. That is very significant. If I am not much mistaken, that is an arrow. And it's an arrow that points right to the centre of the ellipse. That might be trying to tell us something about the centre of the ellipse, not only its geographical position, but what we might expect to find there. I've got about 5 minutes left, so I just want to take you through this. Was the megalithic system known at the end of the 18th century and then forgotten in Washington, D.C.? Absolutely not. Oh, look, George has turned up. Well, no, Thomas has turned up. Don't know how he got there. I told you he'd arrive. This is the Pentagon. The Pentagon was not built until 1941. But it ties in absolutely with the megalithic measurements that I showed you earlier. It's definable to the centre of the ellipse. It's definable to the Capitol building and all the other structures that I mentioned. So the Pentagon itself, right? 366 megalithic yards across the part of the circle that goes between each of its corners. 233 megalithic yards across that circle. Again, bearing out exactly what we had predicted right back at the start of our research when we were writing Civilization 1. We couldn't believe it. There could not be a more perfect megalithic structure imaginable. And there it was in Washington, D.C. It was only built in 1941. What do we know about it? We know that it was the construct that was at the very heart of President Roosevelt at that time. Roosevelt was himself a 33rd degree Freemason. We know that when that was made, it joined up like this. So we get the Pentagon, the ellipse, the Capitol. And if you measure around that, you get 33 times 366 megalithic yards. So it's not only a megalithic structure, it's also a Freemasonic structure. And it is for a very important reason. This particular construct is a Freemasonic construct. It's supposed to be the sacred city of Jerusalem, hypothetically, which is used in the 33 degree rituals of Scottish Rite Freemasonry as practiced in the United States. The most sacred shape in this form of Freemasonry is the triangle, which is there. And that represents the 33rd degree of Freemasonry. It's set within a pentagon, which is the 32nd degree of Freemasonry. This particular degree of Freemasonry deals with a guy who is left in church all night. He's going to become a knight. He won't leave the church. If he does, people will call him a coward. His name is Constans. Everybody goes away. 3 or 4 people come and they try to persuade him to leave. He refuses to leave. But then he hears the sounds of battle outside. In the end, he can't contain himself. He knows that his friends are being killed, that women are being violated, children are being killed. He dashes out. In come the previous people. They find he's missing. They're cheering because they've scored a great victory, and they're talking about this warrior who saved the day for them, but Constans has disappeared, so they start calling him a coward. In come 2 more men carrying a stretcher. On the stretcher is the body of Constans, who's died in the battle. It is now suggested that Constans is the bravest of the brave, because despite his own need to look after himself and his own, he gave himself to other people. Okay? What was happening in 1941? The United States was being dragged into a war it did not want to enter. Roosevelt was quite clear that they would have to fight. But a lot of the people in America didn't want anything to do with a world war at that time. But the verification in Roosevelt's mind and in the mind of all high-ranking Freemasons was this: you cannot stay at home, you cannot do what you want to do when the rest of the world is in danger. So what do? You build the Pentagon, that 5-sided. That makes the 32nd degree of Freemasonry. And what does that create? It creates that triangle I showed you. That's the 33rd degree of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. It is the most extraordinary story imaginable. How on earth has anybody, Freemason or anybody else, managed to maintain a knowledge of megalithic geometry across so many thousand years against all the odds? And it hasn't surfaced, as far as we can tell, anywhere else except on that one occasion in Bath. Well, the other question, why is that arrow pointing to the centre of the ellipse? Don't have much time to tell you, but what I can tell you is this: when the ellipse was laid out in 1880. It was laid out by the American engineers just after the American Civil War. But Casey, who was the guy who was in charge of them, wrote to Congress and he said, I've laid out the ellipse, but I can't do anything with the centre because somebody's digging a great hole there. So, we don't know who was digging the hole, we can't find any information about it, except that we know it was done. We suspect that something really important, something to do with Freemasonry, but also something to do with the world, is buried in a chambered vault underneath the centre of the ellipse. This would be absolutely in accord with Scottish Rite Freemasonry. What that is open to conjecture. But America did what it must do, and it used a very ancient method to do it. It came in and it rescued the world. And I don't think that any more honourable act could have been expected, whether anyone was Freemason, Christian, Muslim, or whatever. Nor do I think that those people who laboured so long and hard to build the very megalithic monuments that we are here to talk about today could have epitomised more the genius that they showed us and that we're still using today. Thank you very much.